It began, as many modern astronomical stories do, not with a shout of discovery, but with the soft glow of a monitor in a room that was only partly lit. A quiet workstation, a quiet night, and a quiet sequence of images taken by a survey telescope doing exactly what it always does, observing the familiar sky with the patient suspicion that something unusual might someday happen. And on that night, something did. Not enough to alarm anyone, not enough to rush down hallways or shout across observatories, just enough to nudge a few pixels into behaving suspiciously. Before we gently explore the quiet facts surrounding 3i Atlas, take a peaceful moment to like and subscribe to the Late Night Scientist channel, and let me know in the comments when and where you're listening, so this soothing science can reach more sleepy minds looking to drift off. The object would eventually earn the name 3i Atlas, a label that sounds more like a filing cabinet code than a traveler from another star. But before that name existed, it was only a faint smear in an automated detection pipeline, an unusually shaped echo passing through the software like a guest who wanders into the wrong meeting by accident. Not disruptive, simply unexpected. In the quiet backstage of astronomy, discoveries rarely appear in the form of fireworks. They make themselves known through numbers lined up in columns, precise to too many decimal places, leaning politely against one another as if trying not to draw attention. A timestamp here, a right ascension there, a magnitude reading that looks a little confused about its place in the world. All things that could mean nothing at all until, slowly, they begin to whisper to the trained eyes watching them. These early moments of discovery feel almost domestic. They are neat, structured, and deeply unromantic. No ancient omens etched in stone. No cosmic thunder. Just a human sitting at a desk, checking the logs of a telescope that has seen more sky than any single lifetime could hold. And in those logs, the faint mathematical footprint of a visitor walking briskly across the heavens. 3i Atlas did not introduce itself by name, of course. It never does. Objects in space tend not to carry identification. Instead, it left the celestial equivalent of a business card, a position in the sky, a brightness that shifted slightly more quickly than expected, and the gentle hint of motion that did not quite match the behavior of anything domestically grown in our solar system. It wasn't misbehaving exactly, just wandering in a direction that implied it had no particular interest in staying. Astronomers are accustomed to such wanderers. The sky is full of things that move, things that brighten or fade, things that pretend to be one thing and turn out to be quite another. But there was an elegance to this anomaly, a subtle irregularity that suggested it was not simply a comet from the outskirts or an asteroid on a routine loop. It was something that seemed to be passing through. And so the computers flagged it, quietly, respectfully, as though tapping a colleague on the shoulder and whispering, "This might be worth a look, if you have a moment." When humans finally turned their attention to it, the object gained its provisional designation, a string of characters that looked like someone had dropped a handful of letters and numbers onto the keyboard and decided to keep the result. Later, when it became clear that it was not native to the solar system, It earned the prefix 3I, the third interstellar object recognized by human observation. A title that sounds grand, but is really just the universe's way of saying, "You are visitor number 3. Please enjoy your stay, brief as it may be." The Atlas part of its name honors the survey that first caught sight of it, as though the telescope had unwittingly adopted the object, presenting it to the world with the mild pride of someone introducing an unexpectedly interesting houseguest. It's a quiet relationship, a telescope scanning the sky, and a distant object drifting into view as if to say hello before moving on. But before the naming, before the press releases, before anyone had a chance to form theories or sketches, 3I Atlas existed in perhaps its purest form, as data. A series of measurements logged without ceremony, reflecting the object's presence in the only language machines truly understand. Numbers lined up with the precision of a watchmaker's tools. There is something almost tender in that moment. The idea that a journey spanning unimaginable distances, unfolding across millions of years, could slip so gently into human awareness. After all, the object had no intention of being found. It likely had no intention at all. Yet its path happened to intersect with the gaze of an observatory on a quiet night, and that was enough to pull it into the collective curiosity of our species. It drifted into our databases the way a leaf might drift onto the surface of a still pond, not splashing, not disturbing, simply arriving. And astronomers, who are experts in the art of noticing things that barely wish to be noticed, recognized that arrival for what it was, the beginning of a story they had not expected to write. In that sense, the name 3I Atlas is not just a label. It is a bookmark placed at the moment when the universe whispered something faintly unusual, and humans, in their infinite habit of listening to the quiet parts, paused long enough to hear it, long before its faint reflection slipped into the view of telescopes on Earth. 3I Atlas had already lived a history so extended, so quietly persistent, that even the concept of travel begins to feel like too active a word. What the object has done is closer to enduring, a gentle persistence through distances that refuse to shrink, and through time so stretched that it becomes less a measurement than a landscape. To imagine its journey, it helps to picture a space devoid of destinations, an environment where nothing waits for anything else. Interstellar space is not a highway between stars. It is a slow suspension, an absence so complete that even the idea of loneliness doesn't quite fit, because loneliness requires the expectation of company. For 3I Atlas, there was only the long forward drift, a motion so subtle it would feel to us almost indistinguishable from stillness. Somewhere in a star system that no longer concerns it, the object began its departure. Not dramatically. Not with the cinematic flourish humans sometimes imagine when they picture cosmic events. Instead, its release from its birthplace was likely a quiet piece of physics, perhaps a gentle gravitational nudge from a passing star, or the accumulated effect of small forces that eventually whispered, "You may go now." And so it did, not as a choice, but as the natural outcome of being an object in a universe that rarely leaves anything completely anchored. The first part of its journey occurred in darkness so thorough that even the best trained earthly eyes would find nothing to focus on. Between stars, the concept of illumination becomes something of a rumor. Light from distant suns spreads thinly across unimaginably broad surfaces until it reaches a point where dust grains can drift for centuries without ever experiencing a single direct beam. In such a realm, Three-Eye Atlas traveled without shadow, without glint, without any sign that it existed except for its own quiet persistence in a place where time itself feels like an afterthought. We often imagine movement as something purposeful, filled with intent or direction. But for Three-Eye Atlas, motion was something more patient. Its trajectory had no need for urgency. After all, nothing was waiting at the end of its path. There was only continuation. Forward, not because forward was meaningful, but because forward was available. Over millions of years, the object crossed expanses that defy easy metaphor. Even comparing interstellar distance to earthly scales becomes clumsy. A road trip across a continent, a voyage across an ocean. These comparisons shrink the truth into something too manageable. The gap between stars is so vast that light itself, the fastest traveler we know, takes years to cross it. Objects like Three-Eye Atlas, moving at far humbler speeds, require far longer, drifting through regions where even the nearest star remains a delicate pinprick in the endless canvas. What stands out about such a journey is not its length, but its gentleness. In interstellar space, almost nothing interrupts you. A grain of dust might pass within miles and still count as a close encounter. Temperature holds steady at a level so cold that heat becomes a kind of myth. The environment is not hostile. Hostility requires activity. Instead, the emptiness offers a sense of profound neutrality. An object can remain itself for eons without a single external force troubling its surface. Through all of this, Three-Eye Atlas continued. It did not accelerate with ambition or slow down from fatigue. Its pace remained steady, steady enough that millions of years slid past it like soft veils, unnoticed and uncounted. If the object had thoughts, which it does not, it might have experienced this journey as a kind of eternal present, an unbroken moment stretched across the incomprehensibly large hallway between stars. There is a certain quiet humor in imagining the object making its way through this vastness with no sense of occasion. While humans often imagine visitors from distant systems as purposeful messengers, Three-Eye Atlas behaves more like a traveler who stepped outside for a moment and, through a series of uneventful circumstances, ended up several light years away without meaning to. Not lost, just exceedingly far from where it started, and far too committed to turning back. As it drifted onward, the environment around it changed so slowly that change itself almost ceased to exist as a concept. The gravitational pull of distant stars shifted the slightest bit. Thin clouds of interstellar dust, stretched into filaments by the movements of the galaxy, slid past it at speeds that, if translated into human terms, would resemble the pace of a glacier politely minding its own business. Everything in this realm exists on a timeline so stretched that the word ancient becomes inadequate. Eventually, though the word eventually feels strange when describing a process lasting millions of years, 3I Atlas began to approach the outskirts of our solar system. Not rapidly, not intentionally, but inevitably. Even at enormous distances, the solar system casts a faint gravitational influence, like the softest of invitations extended across the void. And the object, still continuing in the only direction it had ever known, drifted gradually toward a place where light would finally touch it again. Yet even as it neared our neighborhood, nothing about its journey changed. There was no anticipation, no preparation, just the continuation of a path that began in a star system long since irrelevant and would end in a future equally indifferent. The long way in was never about arrival. It was about the endurance of motion in a universe that neither encourages nor discourages such endurance. 3I Atlas simply remained in this slow, persistent forward state until, by chance alone, it crossed the thin line where human instruments could finally acknowledge its existence. Its journey, long before we ever saw it, was a story of patience. Patience so deep and so effortless that calling it patience at all feels like attributing intention to something that simply was and simply continued. To understand the place 3I Atlas emerged from, one must imagine a kind of silence beyond anything the human mind naturally anticipates. Not the silence of an untouched forest or a late-night coastline, and not the silence found in deep caves or insulated studios. Interstellar silence is a different category entirely, an almost architectural stillness that exists because nothing is present to disturb it. It is not an emptiness waiting to be filled. It is emptiness fulfilling itself completely. In this realm, stars are little more than distant lanterns hung far beyond the reach of their own warmth. Their glow travels outward, yes, but by the time it reaches these deep corridors between systems, it has thinned into something weightless. Light spreads itself so widely across such staggering distances that its arrival feels more like a courtesy than an influence. Most of the time, it never arrives at all. For an object drifting through this quiet, the absence of sunlight is not a dramatic condition. It is simply the default. Darkness takes on a steady, unchanging quality, soft rather than oppressive, neutral rather than ominous. In this darkness, a surface remains cold, not because the cold is trying to claim it, but because nothing is trying to warm it. There is no cosmic tug-of-war here, just a steady state of almost perfect gentleness. The silence itself is not the silence of muted sound, but the silence of physics having very little to do with no dense material to collide, no bustling streams of charged particles, and no sudden temperature gradients to stir the environment. Events become rare. Entire millennia can drift past without a single notable interaction. An object like 3I Atlas could travel for ages without encountering anything larger than a grain of dust, and even those meetings tend to be unremarkable. A soft touch, a tiny deflection. The sorts of interactions that would feel, if they could be felt, like a whisper brushing against a window. For most matters in the universe, being in interstellar space is a quiet retirement. There is no stellar wind to sculpt surfaces, no radiation gusts to carve intricate patterns, No gravitational neighbors pulling at edges with mischievous insistence. Shapes remain shapes for ages. Imperfections stay precise. The environment offers a kind of preservation that museums can only dream of. An unbroken stillness where nothing fades or decays unless time itself decides to get involved. And time rarely rushes in this domain. In this great stillness, direction becomes nearly irrelevant. Not because the object is lost, but because the concept of orientation depends on having landmarks, and here there are none. A star behind you is barely distinguishable from a star in front. Both appear as faint dots on a sphere without edges. One could spin endlessly and learn nothing new with each rotation. The universe here offers no signposts, no north or south, no sense of closeness or distance that can be grasped intuitively. It is a place where even the idea of toward feels oddly extravagant. For something drifting through this medium, existence is not an active process. It is a passive one. Instead of navigating, the object simply continues. Instead of responding, it simply remains. One might imagine 3i Atlas as a traveler in a deserted land who eventually stops calling out for company, not from sadness, but because calling requires expectation, and expectation has long since dissolved into the numb quiet of endless continuity. The energy here is minimal. Thermal agitation slows to a near standstill. Molecules, where they exist at all, move only because absolute stillness is physically impossible. But it is close. Close enough that matter in these domains behaves as though it is contemplating stillness with admirable seriousness. If 3i Atlas carries volatile materials, they remain frozen more firmly than any winter on Earth has ever known. If it has structures or fragments, they drift in sync with it, undisturbed except by the gentlest constraints of inertia. Even cosmic rays, those persistent travelers that cross the universe with restless enthusiasm, arrive sparsely. They pass through without ceremony, the way a distant traveler might stroll past a bench without acknowledging the person seated there. They leave no lasting conversation behind them. The region does not encourage conversation. Occasionally, the distant thrum of a galactic event, perhaps a supernova, perhaps a star being born, sends out a faint ripple. But by the time such ripples reach this deep, empty corridor, their strength has diluted into mere suggestion. A slight uptick in radiation, a gentle shift in the background canvas. Nothing that interrupts the calm. In fact, these faint ripples are almost welcome. They are the closest thing to action the region typically experiences, and even then, the excitement level remains comfortably within sleep-friendly bounds. This is the environment that shaped 3i Atlas for the majority of its existence. Not a place of origins, but a place of endurance. A place where events do not accumulate, where stories do not unfold, and where the universe appears to practice its quietest, most minimalist form of being. For millions of years, the object drifted through this silence, not carving through space, not struggling against forces, but simply coexisting with a vastness that neither hindered nor guided it. The silence did not greet it. The silence did not release it. It merely remained beside it, a companion so constant and so uneventful that the idea of company becomes almost philosophical. And perhaps the most striking aspect of this interstellar silence is that it never once required the object to acknowledge it. Silence does not ask questions. It does not request understanding. It envelops everything equally and expects nothing in return. It is a silence that contains no absence because it has never known presence. This was the backdrop to 3I Atlas's long, slow drift, a realm where nothing happened, and where the absence of event became beautifully the entire point. Astronomy is often imagined as a pursuit of grand nights under sweeping skies, telescopes pointed at glittering constellations, while discoveries reveal themselves with theatrical clarity. The truth, however, is far quieter and far more adorable in its own procedural way. Most discoveries begin not with a triumphant gasp, but with algorithms sorting through images while the humans responsible for them sip lukewarm coffee and gently remind themselves that sleep is still, theoretically, part of the human experience. The systems that noticed 3I Atlas were not hunting for anything exotic. They weren't expecting something foreign to wander into frame. They were doing what they always do, scanning, comparing, and politely flagging anything that didn't quite fit. These observatories, especially wide-field survey instruments, operate like cosmic librarians meticulously cataloging the night sky. Every star, every patch of background, every drifting speck is part of their well-organized archive. When something unfamiliar appears, it's not a dramatic interruption. It's more like a new book being quietly slipped onto a shelf that had previously insisted it was full. One of the gentle ironies of such systems is that the human observers often discover remarkable things only because they have grown deeply familiar with the unremarkable. They know how the sky ought to look, which smudges are galaxies, which streaks belong to satellites, and which bright dots are simply stars pretending to be important. Because they know the ordinary so well, the slightest deviation tends to stand out, not like a trumpet blast, but like one instrument in an orchestra playing half a note longer than it should. Subtle but unmistakable to a trained ear. Automated detection systems aid this vigilance by monitoring everything with a level of patience no human could hope to maintain. These systems take multiple images of the same region night after night, layering them digitally to catch the faint differences that reveal new objects. A brightening spot here, a drifting point there, a pixel that insists on behaving differently, even after being told politely that it should stay where it was placed. Computers don't get irritated by such defiance. They simply report it. And so, on a quiet night, the first signs of 3I Atlas appeared as a small anomaly in this ocean of carefully arranged data. Something moved in a way the software found suspicious, not dramatically, not even quickly, but distinctly enough for the program to send a message to its human supervisors that essentially meant, "I may be imagining things, but would you mind looking at this?" The human response to such alerts is rarely cinematic. No one sprints into corridors or drops everything in alarm. More often, someone squints at a monitor, rubs their eyes, and leans closer to confirm whether the mysterious dot is genuinely moving or just part of the camera's ongoing attempts to express its feelings through noise patterns. And once they confirm that the movement is real, there is usually a moment of soft amusement. Because the universe, vast and ancient as it is, has once again chosen to reveal itself through the smallest, faintest irregularity. Astronomers have grown used to the idea that the cosmos sends its surprises not through grand gestures, but through gentle discrepancies. A dot moves too fast, or too slowly, or in a direction that suggests it wasn't invited to the solar system, but wandered in anyway. The spreadsheets and star charts of observation centers become living documents, shifting and updating as new data streams in. Many astronomers joke that the universe is one of their less predictable co-workers. Quiet most days, but occasionally slipping something unexpected onto their desk with no explanation. This quiet style of discovery has its own understated charm. Instead of thunderbolts, there is routine. Instead of drum rolls, there is dim, diffuse glow on a computer screen. A person sits in a room filled with softly humming electronics, perhaps wearing a sweater because observatories are rarely warm, and reviews the numbers. There is an elegance to the monotony, the slow scanning, the chart updating, the cross-checking with previous nights. And then, amid the calm repetition, something small refuses to align with expectations. When astronomers examine these deviations, they do so with a gentle blend of skepticism and hope. Most anomalies, after all, turn out to be perfectly ordinary objects behaving in slightly confusing ways. And yet, there's always that quiet thrill, the possibility that the cosmos has handed them something genuinely rare, not shouted, not announced, just placed delicately in front of them. When 3I Atlas first entered this recognition process, it did so without flourish. A faint cluster of data points suggested motion that didn't match the rhythms of the solar system's usual residents. It was like spotting a stranger strolling through a town where everyone else walks in predictable circles. The object wasn't misbehaving. It was simply following rules written elsewhere. As the data accumulated, astronomers began to share notes, each comparing the object's subtle drift. Not hurriedly. Most discoveries do not demand urgency, but with the calm, steady attention of people accustomed to waiting for the universe to finish its sentences. They double-checked exposure times, recalibrated their instruments, and confirmed that the moving dot was not a piece of equipment expressing artistic impulses. And gradually, the object's presence solidified into consensus. What makes this process beautiful is how deeply it relies on humility. Astronomers do not assume meaning. They verify. They watch. They let the sky speak in tiny increments. The discovery of 3I Atlas became, in that sense, a celebration of patient observation, the kind that rewards meticulous routines rather than impulsive leaps. It emerged not from a moment of inspiration, but from accumulated quiet hours spent tending to data. And so, in these ordinary habits, in these small acts of numerical caretaking, astronomers noticed something that wasn't supposed to be there. Not because it called attention to itself, but because they had trained themselves to listen when the universe whispers instead of when it shouts. Most objects that wander into our solar system eventually find themselves woven into its long-term choreography. They fall into loops, wide or narrow. They settle into routines dictated by gravity's persistent suggestions. Comets, asteroids, dust, almost all of them learn to dance to the rhythm of the sun, circling back with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Some become regulars, returning like old friends who pretend to be surprised each time they arrive. Others drift in temporarily before spiraling away again, promising to return in a few hundred years, as if time were a minor scheduling inconvenience. But 3i Atlas is not one of these creatures. It came into the solar system with the unmistakable demeanor of a traveler who already has somewhere else to be. Nothing about its movement suggests an interest in staying, nor does it adopt the leisurely arcs that characterize bound orbits. Instead, its path resembles a single sweeping brushstroke across the solar system, a gesture made once and never repeated, confident in its forwardness. To describe its trajectory, astronomers use the term hyperbolic, though the word sounds more dramatic than the movement feels. A hyperbolic path is not a frantic escape. It is simply a line that refuses to bend into a circle. The sun's gravity reaches out. Certainly, it always does. But in this case, the pull is not enough to persuade the visitor to linger. The result is a long, graceful curve that teases the idea of an orbit for a moment, before gliding onward, untouched by the kind of commitment gravity usually demands. When watching simulations of this kind of motion, one notices something oddly soothing. Instead of looping back, the object merely changes direction slightly, like someone pausing just long enough to admire a landscape before continuing down a road they had already chosen. The sun becomes a landmark, not a destination. Planetary paths curve beneath it, like the lines of a map drawn for someone else entirely. It's worth noting that the solar system does not take offense at this behavior. It welcomes objects on every kind of journey, those who stay, those who wander, and those who merely pass through as if browsing a celestial marketplace without buying anything. 3i Atlas's disinterest in settling is not a rejection. It is simply the geometry of a life spent elsewhere, shaped by forces far beyond our own neighborhood. The concept of a visitor with no obligation to stay carries a gentle philosophical quality. It invites contemplation on what it means for something to enter our awareness without becoming part of our story. 3i Atlas is here temporarily. It will not return for anniversaries. It will not weave itself into cycles we can predict or anticipate. It moves as though the idea of repetition is foreign to it, as though time to it is not a loop but an open horizon stretching endlessly ahead. There is a whimsical charm in imagining the object drifting past the sun with the faintest air of polite indifference. It neither hurries nor hesitates. It simply acknowledges the gravitational request and then declines it with the smooth courtesy of someone turning down an invitation they genuinely appreciate but cannot accept. One might imagine the sun extending its pull like a friendly handshake, only for the visitor to smile and say, "Thank you, but I can't stay long. I'm just passing through." And pass through it does, threading between planets with the placid assuredness of something that understands its own path more deeply than any observer could. Unlike local comets, which often bear the marks of long-term engagement, tails brightened by repeated visits, surfaces molded by solar warmth, 3I Atlas remains untouched by local history. It arrives pristine, carrying no expectations and leaving no debts. Its trajectory reminds us that gravity, for all its power, is not an absolute ruler. It is more like a persuasive tutor whose influence depends on proximity and timing. Some objects fall easily into its lessons. Others, like 3I Atlas, arrive with prior commitments. The sun tugs gently at it, reshaping its direction by a modest amount. But the object's outbound path remains unbroken in intention. It came from elsewhere, and elsewhere it will return, not back to its origin, but toward whatever distant region the galaxy chooses next. What is striking about this movement is its simplicity. No loops, no winding detours, only a single approach, a single departure, and a quiet refusal to become entangled. In an astronomical landscape filled with spirals and circles, this path feels almost minimalist, as though the object distills motion into its most essential form, a journey with a beginning and an end, but no middle that repeats. There is something soothing about that kind of clarity. A hyperbolic trajectory does not ask to be understood in full. It merely asks to be witnessed as it is, a line that bends once, then continues, a visitor that enters the solar system without any wish to redefine itself, a presence that does not require attachment to be meaningful. For astronomers, this type of path carries a gentle thrill, not the thrill of prediction. Hyperbolic visitors do not stay long enough for prediction to become a pastime, but the thrill of observing something that belongs, in a very literal sense, to the rest of the galaxy. Such objects are reminders that the solar system is not an isolated bubble. It is a crossroads, occasionally crossed by travelers who owe nothing to its patterns. And when 3I Atlas eventually moves beyond our reach again, it will do so with the same unhurried determination it displayed upon arrival. No farewell, no lingering. Only the continuation of a path that treats the solar system as an interlude instead of a home, a visitor with no obligation to stay, yet whose brief presence, by the quiet laws of motion and chance, becomes a chapter in our own story of watching the sky. The challenge of describing 3I Atlas begins with the simple fact that it does not remain in one place long enough for humans to examine it with the comfortable thoroughness they prefer. It moves gently but decisively, and because of this, astronomers must work with glimpses, brief flashes of reflected light, small variations in brightness, patterns that appear for a moment and then shift again as if the object is politely changing the subject. Attempts to understand its shape end up looking less like a portrait and more like a series of thoughtful sketches drawn from memory. When astronomers talk about its form, they do so with an admirable softness, choosing words like likely, perhaps, and suggestive of. These words are the linguistic equivalent of leaving a respectful amount of room in a conversation, acknowledging that the object has not given them enough material for certainty. What little they can gather comes from how the object brightens and dims as it rotates, an astronomical strobe pattern hinting at its geometry without ever declaring it outright. The brightness variations of 3I Atlas suggest that it is not a tidy sphere. Spheres, after all, are reliable creatures. They reflect light consistently as they turn. But 3I Atlas flickers gently, as though certain angles catch sunlight better than others. This implies some degree of elongation or irregularity, the sort of shape that would never pass a quality inspection, but works perfectly well for roaming the galaxy. In the calm imagination, one might picture a form somewhat stretched, like a pebble smoothed unevenly by forces long forgotten, or perhaps something more angular, an object whose surfaces are arranged in a geometry that casually disregards human preferences for symmetry. Scientists propose possibilities: elongated body, flattened edges, maybe even fragments connected in a loose arrangement. None of these ideas are stated with conviction. They are more like polite suggestions offered to a guest who declines to turn fully toward the camera. The object's rotation complicates things further. It does not spin in a neat, punctual fashion, but seems to wobble, almost as though deciding mid-turn that another axis might be more interesting. This kind of motion, called tumbling, makes the interpretation of brightness changes a delightful challenge, rather like attempting to guess the shape of a falling leaf by the way it glints in sunlight. Some astronomers suspect the surface of 3I Atlas might be unusually reflective, not shiny in a polished way, but reflective in the manner of materials that have spent ages in cosmic cold, their surfaces hardened into a sheen that behaves unpredictably under fresh sunlight. This variability complicates shape modeling. A bright spot could be a smooth patch, or a jagged one catching the light just so, or even a coating of volatile materials waking up under the warmth of a new star. The result is that a single glimmer might mean many things, and the object, polite but inscrutable, refuses to clarify which. Others consider the possibility that parts of the object's surface are darker, absorbing light in ways that make certain features vanish entirely from detection. A dark patch here, a reflective facet there, and suddenly interpretations of its silhouette become something of a cosmic guessing game. Not an unscientific one, to be clear. Astronomers apply rigorous modeling and simulation to narrow down the options. But even rigor has limits when the subject keeps rotating out of view. The humor in this situation is gentle but persistent. A highly advanced civilization, packed with instruments capable of detecting planets around distant stars, is collectively squinting at a moving smudge and saying, well, it might be shaped like this. The universe, in its infinite patience, appears to enjoy giving astronomers puzzles that mimic the feeling of assembling a jigsaw puzzle without having seen the box cover. One theory suggests the object may be stretching its brightness variations through rotation rates that shift over time. If 3I Atlas is indeed tumbling, then the way it swings its facets toward the sun could change unpredictably. Imagine a baton twirled in a slow, irregular rhythm, not chaotic, but gently refusing to commit to repetition. In such a case, the light curve becomes a story told in fragments, each fragment offering a clue, but none providing enough information to finish the tale. Another hypothesis entertains the idea that 3I Atlas may have lost material earlier in its journey, leaving behind an uneven form shaped by ancient events. pieces may have fractured away long before it approached our solar system, giving the object an asymmetry that hints at its past without disclosing the details. If true, its current shape would be a fossil record of forces that no longer act upon it, memories etched into irregular edges. Even its size is not known with satisfying precision. Estimates depend on how reflective the surface is, and reflectivity, as noted, is one of the many things the object refuses to clarify. If it is bright because it is reflective, it could be relatively small. If it is bright because it is large, it might have a more substantial presence than initial models imply. Either possibility could be correct. Both are treated with the same courteous uncertainty. In this ongoing ambiguity, there is a kind of serenity. Rather than demanding answers, astronomers allow themselves to coexist with the unknown. They trace the light curves, build models, test assumptions, and yet accept that this visitor's shape might remain a quiet, unsolved riddle. The object does not need to be perfectly described for its presence to hold meaning. It is almost refreshing, in a world that often seeks precision, to encounter something content to be partially understood. 3i Atlas teaches, in its drifting way, that not all forms must be captured, and not all mysteries are meant to be resolved. Its shape, whatever it may be, remains an exercise in respectful curiosity, a reminder that the universe tends to reveal itself in fragments, and that sometimes the fragments are enough. For most of its immeasurably long journey, 3i Atlas traveled in a darkness so complete that the idea of illumination must have seemed like a forgotten rumor. In interstellar space, light thins out until it becomes an abstraction, something that exists elsewhere, too distant to influence anything except the imagination of species that depend on it. But as the object drifted toward our solar system, a faint warmth began to gather on its horizon. Though warmth here is a poetic indulgence, what truly formed was the earliest thread of sunlight stretching across a gulf that would humble even the most extravagant scales. At first, the sunlight was little more than a suggestion. Photons scattered thinly, arriving like distant travelers who barely made an impression. This light carried the gentlest touch imaginable, so faint that even calling it illumination feels ambitious. But 3i Atlas was not accustomed to any light at all, and even this delicate brush might have been notable had the object been capable of noticing. The surface, cold, ancient, shaped by nothing but time and its own inertia, received these first photons with the same neutrality it had given to everything else across the ages. As it drifted closer, the sun's influence grew more substantial. Light no longer arrived as an afterthought. It became something continuous, a steady flow rather than sporadic arrivals. This was the first environment in an extraordinary span of time where light existed not as a statistical rarity, but as a presence. And with that presence came the first clues humans could gather about the visitor's character. We often talk about light as though it acts deliberately, revealing what it touches with intention. In truth, it behaves more like a polite messenger, always available, always willing to describe surfaces and textures if someone stands ready to interpret its reflections. With 3i Atlas, this exchange became our only form of dialogue. Humans could not smell it, taste it, or listen to it. They could not feel its contours or trace its edges, but they could watch how sunlight rebounded off its surface. And from those scattered glimmers, entire stories emerged. Astronomers measure brightness not as a static value, but as a shifting sequence, a rhythm shaped by rotation, reflection, and distance. As 3I Atlas approached, its brightness followed a pattern that seemed almost conversational. A rise here, a dip there, a gentle oscillation that suggested facets, angles, and textures. The object didn't speak, but the sunlight translated its silent spin into a readable script. The brightness changes were subtle at first, not dramatic enough to excite in the traditional sense, yet compelling in the way quiet discoveries often are. As the object rotated, particular surfaces momentarily aligned with the sun, scattering light toward Earth with slightly more enthusiasm. Then those same surfaces turned away again, letting dimmer areas take their place. The result was a soft, flickering pulse, steady enough to analyze, delicate enough to remain a mystery. These variations told astronomers that the object possessed no uniformity. A flawless sphere would have glowed steadily, unbothered by orientation, but 3I Atlas offered a shimmering profile shaped by irregularities, coated perhaps in patchworks of materials with differing reflectivity. Certain parts might have been smooth enough to cast broad, even glints. Others might have been rough or porous, trapping more light than they returned. A mosaic of surfaces formed a mosaic of reflections. In this way, sunlight became a kind of interpreter between a distant traveler and the species observing it. Every photon that bounced off the object carried a fragment of information back across millions of kilometers, tiny messengers bearing tiny clues. The universe communicates through many channels, but for objects as remote and indifferent as this one, reflected light becomes the only reliable accent. As 3I Atlas approached still closer, the intensity of sunlight increased at a pace dictated by gravitational geometry. Yet the object's response did not become flamboyant. Even when bathed in more substantial illumination, it maintained an air of reserve. No dramatic outbursts, no sparkling displays, just a steady participation in a process older than any civilization. Sunlight touching a surface, light scattering outward, someone far away noticing. In those reflected glimmers, astronomers found not answers, but possibilities. A brighter flash might hint at a flat plane angled just right. A measured dimming could suggest concave geometry or a region coated with darker material. The process became a study in inference, a discipline where certainty is replaced by graceful probability. Light gives hints, but rarely explanations. It draws a contour, then asks observers to imagine the rest. There is a quiet beauty in this asymmetry. 3I Atlas did not arrive with any intention of being studied, yet the sunlight around it willingly collaborated with human curiosity. For a brief window of time, the object and the light shared a conversation, even if one side remained oblivious. Astronomers often speak fondly of such interactions, not because they yield all the answers, but because they offer something equally precious: the chance to recognize a stranger through nothing but the way it catches the morning star. As the object continued deeper into the solar system, every shift in brightness added another stroke to the portrait. It remained incomplete, of course. It always would. But the painting took shape in luminous fragments. The glint of sunlight was the only signature 3i Atlas left behind, the only trace that could cross the vacuum toward Earth with enough clarity to be understood. And when it eventually drifted far enough that the sunlight began to fade again, the dialogue tapered off, not abruptly, but tenderly. The glimmers softened. The variations grew fainter. The messenger photons dwindled in number. The conversation felt as though it were closing gently, like the final pages of a book that never promised resolution. For a short while, sunlight and a wandering interstellar traveler came together, and through that quiet encounter, humans gained their knowledge. Partial, delicate, and beautiful in its incompleteness. Light touched a stranger, and in doing so allowed us to see just enough to know the stranger existed. When astronomers track the motion of a visiting object, they expect it to follow a trajectory shaped primarily by gravity. Gravity is dependable, polite in its consistency, predictable in its influence, and rarely inclined toward improvisation. Most wandering bodies, whether they come from the outer solar system or deeper cosmic neighborhoods, move in ways that can be charted with comforting accuracy. Their paths respond to the sun and planets, like threads gently guided by invisible hands. But every so often, something wanders through the solar system with a motion that declines to follow these anticipated patterns quite as neatly as one might prefer. The deviations are not dramatic. 3i Atlas did not zigzag or perform any stunts. Instead, it drifted with a slightly different acceleration than gravity alone could account for, like a boat moving across perfectly calm water, yet carried just a hair faster by a current no one can see. Not enough to alarm anyone, just enough to invite thoughtful tilting of the head. When astronomers first noticed the slight discrepancy, the reaction was not panic or excitement, but rather an almost affectionate curiosity. Space objects, after all, are allowed to be individuals. They do not sign contracts promising to adhere to mathematical ideals, and 3i Atlas in particular had already demonstrated an affinity for quiet nonconformity. If anything, its subtle divergence seemed consistent with its overall personality. A visitor with habits shaped somewhere far beyond the solar system's familiar gravitational conversations. The deviation in motion was small, so small that, had observations been the tiniest bit less precise, it might have blended into the background noise. But modern instruments are attentive. They track positions with the kind of precision that would impress even the most meticulous clockmakers. And when you watch an object that closely, you notice when it drifts slightly off script. The challenge then becomes understanding why. One possibility is that the object is shedding material, nothing dramatic, just occasional particles escaping into space. Even a gentle release of gas or dust can give a small nudge, the way a whisper of air can subtly change the path of a drifting feather. If 3i Atlas contains ices or fragile compounds formed long ago, Exposure to sunlight might coax tiny amounts of vapor into escaping. Not enough to create a tail visible from Earth, but enough to add the faintest push to its motion. Another possibility lies in the shape itself. If the object is uneven or rotates in a complex rhythm, solar radiation can exert varying pressure on different surfaces. Light may seem weightless, but photons carry momentum, and when they strike an object's surface, they impart tiny forces. Over long stretches of time, these tiny forces accumulate. The effect is usually minor, but for a small interstellar traveler, even minor influences can produce a measurable deviation. The universe often moves objects not with forceful commands, but with innumerable gentle taps. There is also the consideration of thermal emission, surfaces warmed by the sun radiating heat outward. When heat leaves unevenly, the recoil can produce a slight push, almost like the object is exhaling with mild annoyance at the attention. It is a subtlety so delicate that it borders on poetic. Motion shaped not only by the gravity of stars, but by the simple act of absorbing and releasing warmth. Astronomers, in their calm way, take all these possibilities into account. They run models, they adjust predictions, they incorporate the deviations with the same patience one uses when walking a dog that occasionally decides to sniff a mailbox. It is not a problem. It is simply part of the motion. Throughout these analyses, what stands out is the tone of the scientific conversation. No one claims certainty. No one rushes toward dramatic explanations. The deviation is small enough to inspire humility and large enough to inspire contemplation, a pleasant combination for those who study celestial mechanics with a fondness for nuance. Indeed, objects like 3I Atlas remind astronomers that the universe does not owe perfect compliance to equations. The equations are approximations, beautiful ones, deeply effective, but approximations nonetheless. Real objects have textures, histories, compositions, and quirks. They respond to the cosmos with their own quiet individuality, and the cosmos accepts that individuality so thoroughly that the slightest deviation becomes a window into a more detailed understanding of what the object is made of and how it behaves under sunlight's touch. One might imagine the universe watching the entire scene with a serene lack of concern. A small visitor enters the solar system, drifts a little faster or slower than predicted, and continues on its way. Nothing breaks. Nothing falters. The planets maintain their courses. The sun maintains its glow. A dust mote receives a little extra push, and that is the entirety of the drama. In a cosmos governed by immense forces and unimaginable energies, such a deviation does not even rise to the level of an event. It is simply part of the background rhythm. There is a gentle comfort in that perspective. Humans may examine the deviation with meticulous care, but the universe itself remains untroubled. This contrast creates a kind of quiet humor, astronomers laboring over graphs and simulations, while the object continues drifting forward with no awareness of the interest it has generated. If 3I Atlas could shrug, it probably would. Yet these small shifts are valuable precisely because they are subtle. They allow researchers to infer properties that would otherwise remain hidden. A tiny deviation becomes a clue becomes a model becomes a conversation. Through such conversations, humanity learns not just how objects move, but how they interact with their environment, however faint that interaction may be. In the end, the deviation becomes more than a technical detail. It is a reminder that the universe rarely behaves with perfect symmetry. Real motion contains texture. Real trajectories contain personality. And when 3I Atlas drifted through the solar system just a little differently than expected, it offered a soft nudge, not of acceleration, but of perspective. Not everything that behaves unexpectedly is asking to be understood. Some things simply are. And the universe, in its vast composure, seems entirely unbothered by our surprise. When a new interstellar object enters the solar system, astronomers inevitably feel the faint tug of comparison. It is an instinct as old as observation itself, seeing something unfamiliar and immediately reaching into memory for a precedent. Yet with visitors that drift in from beyond the sun's influence, the library of comparable examples remains surprisingly small, and each entry in it behaves with enough individuality to render the exercise only partly useful. 3I Atlas joins this delicate lineage, and as it does, scientists find themselves gently acknowledging similarities while understanding, almost with amusement, that no tidy pattern is forming. The temptation to compare arises because comparison feels reassuring. If a new guest resembles an older one, then perhaps their behaviors can be understood through similar frameworks. But interstellar travelers tend to arrive like guests who have not read the dress code. They bring their own histories, their own materials, their own rhythms. Whatever shaped them did so far from Earth, in stellar neighborhoods whose conditions we can only guess at. As a result, each visitor carries the signature of its birthplace, written into its surface and its motion in a language only partly decipherable through telescopes. For astronomers, observing 3I Atlas becomes an exercise in appreciating divergence. One might quietly recall another visitor and think, perhaps this one will share that feature, only to find it does not. The universe, in its expansive generosity, seems reluctant to repeat itself so soon. Where one visitor may have exhibited stark brightness changes or a distinctly elongated silhouette, another might display subtler flickers or a rounder profile. Each difference is not a contradiction, but a reminder. Interstellar space produces travelers shaped by countless environments and events, and attempting to mold them into a single archetype is a comforting hope, not an expectation grounded in nature. This gentle refusal of uniformity carries a kind of lesson. Our solar system, with its familiar planets and well-behaved moons, encourages the impression that celestial objects follow patterns, distinct categories, repeated behaviors, cycles predictable to many decimal places. Beyond our system, however, variety is the rule. When astronomers discuss interstellar visitors, they do so with a tone that blends scientific caution with a soft acceptance that predictions must be held loosely. An object may rotate differently, reflect light differently, or follow a trajectory slightly unlike any they have charted before. 3i Atlas offers its own set of distinct traits. Its movement, its brightness profile, its response to sunlight. All of these characteristics place it within the small family of extrasolar guests, while simultaneously emphasizing its singularity. It behaves like a relative whose resemblance is only visible at certain angles and easily lost if one stares too long. This is not a flaw in our understanding. It is simply the nature of things that formed under unknown suns, shaped by forces the solar system has never hosted. Even the timeline of its visit underscores this individuality. Each interstellar traveler follows its own schedule, entering the solar system at a moment determined not by cosmic coordination, but by millions of years of quiet drifting. To imagine them as a sequence implies intention, yet their arrivals are accidents of geometry, crossings of paths arranged long before there were observers to record them. 3i Atlas appears precisely when its orbit dictates, neither early nor late, neither announcing itself nor apologizing for the timing. Though astronomers avoid leaning too heavily on comparisons, the contrasts themselves become gently enlightening. The differences highlight the range of possible structures and materials that exist beyond the sun's domain. They suggest that what we have seen so far is only a sparse sampling, 2 or 3 grains selected from a beach whose shoreline spans the galaxy. If this small sample already reveals such variation, then the broader diversity must be extraordinary. There is a subtle humor in the scientific community's cautious attempts to make sense of these patterns that refuse to be patterns. Humans tend to enjoy categorization. It brings order to a universe that resists tidy boxes. And yet every interstellar newcomer seems to quietly remind them that cosmic order is not obligated to align with human preferences. One can attempt to create a checklist, but the universe, with its sprawling creativity, will inevitably file its objects in ways that ignore the checklist entirely. This, strangely enough, becomes part of the comfort. The fact that 3i Atlas does not neatly resemble previous visitors suggests the galaxy is full of surprises, not dramatic ones, but gentle deviations that keep scientific curiosity alive without overwhelming it. The lack of repetition encourages astronomers to approach each object with a fresh, receptive mind, free from assumptions that could narrow their view. Comparisons, when made, are done quietly, almost like fond recollections rather than attempts to enforce structure. A familiar behavior may surface, a brightness fluctuation somewhat reminiscent of another object, a trajectory that curves with a faint echo of visitor past. But these similarities remain soft, never allowed to overshadow the uniqueness at hand. Each interstellar traveler is acknowledged as a singular occurrence, shaped by circumstances so remote and ancient that they feel less like relatives and more like distant acquaintances who happen to share a certain gravitational accent. In this subdued framework, 3i Atlas finds its place not by conforming, but by adding a new entry into the growing collection of galactic wanderers. Its presence expands the palette of possibilities. Its differences, far from being complications, become insights. And its individuality, rather than bewildering, becomes a quiet reminder that patterns, while comforting, are not guarantees. What emerges is a kind of humility, Recognition that humanity's sample size of interstellar visitors is still too small to draw conclusions, and that the universe seems perfectly content to supply variety instead of repetition. 3i Atlas, by being just distinct enough, reinforces that truth with graceful calm. And so the comparisons we try not to make fade naturally into background musing, replaced by a deeper appreciation that each visitor from beyond the sun arrives bearing its own quiet story, written not to match others, but to stand gently, confidently alone. When discussing the journey of an interstellar traveler like 3i Atlas, it is tempting to focus on the moment of discovery, on that brief human interval during which the object becomes visible, measured, debated, modeled, and quietly wondered about. But to understand its place in the universe, one must shift perspective to timescales that stretch far beyond anything a single species can experience. Doing so reveals that our attention, while sincere and curious, occupies only a microscopic portion of the object's story. For 3i Atlas, the solar system is not a destination, but a briefly encountered environment, a passing brightness encountered during an otherwise interminable drift. The time it spends within reach of human instruments is astonishingly short, a few months of detectable presence, perhaps a bit more if one counts the faint approach and slow departure. Against the backdrop of millions of years spent traveling through the Milky Way, this window is so narrow it practically vanishes. Imagine for a moment a timeline of the object's journey stretched across a distance the length of a field. Humanity's observation occupies something like the thickness of a single blade of grass along its edge, visible only if one kneels, squints, and examines the boundary with deliberate focus. The rest is unmarked space, representing an age during which the object had no witness at all. This imbalance does not diminish the importance of observation from a scientific standpoint. It simply offers perspective. 3i Atlas does not meaningfully change because it was seen. Its path remains unaltered by human interest. The universe, vast and enduring, accepts such encounters without commentary. Whatever significance we attach to the moment arises from our own curiosity, not from any cosmic acknowledgement. There is a subtle calm in this recognition. To the object, the solar system is just another region it passes through, no more or less significant than any other place touched by its trajectory. It carries no awareness of the sun's warmth, no understanding that countless eyes track its movement, no recognition that it has momentarily entered the narrative of a planet crowded with beings who enjoy naming things. It does not detect the scrutiny or the fascination. It simply continues. This continuity is one of the most humbling and soothing aspects of contemplating deep time. Human life is filled with beginnings and endings, goals and milestones, each defined by intervals we consider meaningful. But 3i Atlas exists on a scale where such markers dissolve. Its journey is not divided into phases. It is one uninterrupted motion from long before it entered the solar system to long after it has left. There is no chapter in its story specifically labeled Encounter with Earth. That labeling is ours alone. Under this perspective, cosmic indifference becomes strangely comforting. The universe is not hostile or dismissive. It is simply vast, beyond the reach of preference. Objects like 3i Atlas drift through time in a way that demands nothing and expects nothing. They offer an example of existence that is free from urgency, unaffected by observation, and entirely unbothered by the notion of being understood. For astronomers, recognizing the brevity of such encounters brings a sense of gentle melancholy, though not the dramatic kind. It is the sort that arises when watching a distant ship pass across the horizon, visible for only a moment before fading into its own world. One can appreciate its presence without expecting it to turn around for a longer look. Even the light that reveals the object to us participates in this fleetingness. Sunlight touches 3i Atlas briefly, reflects toward Earth, and is captured by telescopes only during a narrow stretch of time. Before and after this interval, there is nothing to see. The universe does not pause to grant observers a longer viewing period. It simply follows its own timetable, leaving us to work within the moments available. This impermanence encourages a kind of philosophical stillness. It reminds us that not everything aligns with human rhythms. In a world filled with schedules, deadlines, and seasons, there is something quietly liberating about engaging with an object that follows none of these patterns. 3i Atlas offers an encounter entirely on cosmic terms, brief, unrepeatable, and indifferent to comprehension. Yet the brevity of the encounter does not diminish its wonder. In fact, it may heighten it. Knowing that the object will not linger invites a gentler kind of attention, one rooted not in expectation, but in appreciation. The awareness that it will soon fade from view makes its presence feel like a passing breeze, something that touches a moment, but does not remain long enough to reshape it. And so, while the encounter between humanity and 3i Atlas lasts only a whisper of time, the whisper is enough. Enough to observe, enough to speculate, enough to marvel at the union of two entirely separate temporal scales, the fleeting human one and the continuous cosmic one. Eventually, 3i Atlas will resume its quiet march across distances where no one watches and no one measures. It will return to the anonymity of interstellar space, a region where time expands so widely that even the concept of passing years seems strangely decorative. In that immense silence, the object will not carry any memory of being seen. It will simply continue, as it always has, and as it will long after our species has concluded its own brief visit to cosmic time. This imbalance between our awareness and its indifference is not a loss, but a reminder that the universe moves with rhythms beyond urgency, that not all stories include protagonists, and that some encounters exist purely because two paths happen to cross at the right moment. 3i Atlas does not care that it was noticed, but we care, and that caring, set against the backdrop of a universe unhurried by our curiosity, creates a quiet harmony between fleeting attention and endless motion. To consider the material of 3i Atlas is to step into a realm of antiquity so profound that ordinary measures of time feel like toys by comparison. The object is composed not merely of substances, but of history in its most literal form, a collection of particles assembled before Earth had cooled enough to support oceans. before the sun settled into its stable glow, before any creature had eyes capable of noticing starlight. Whatever 3i Atlas is made of, it is older than the familiar markers humans use to orient themselves in the past. It belongs to an era when the galaxy was still deciding what kinds of worlds it might permit. When astronomers speak about interstellar objects, they do so with a reverence rooted in this immense age. Even the most cautious estimates suggest that the material comprising 3i Atlas condensed around a distant star so long ago that its birthplace might now be unrecognizable or gone entirely. The star could have dimmed into obscurity or flared to a final brightness, or drifted so far around the galactic center that even tracing its lineage would be like trying to identify the original tree from which a single autumn leaf once fell. This material, dust grains, frozen volatiles, perhaps fragments of ancient rock, was shaped during an era when galaxies were still quietly rearranging themselves. Each particle has survived more revolutions around the galactic core than humans have completed around the sun by many orders of magnitude. One might say the object carries with it the memory of a time long before anything alive attempted to remember. The age is staggering not because it is unfamiliar, but because it resists mental anchoring. Human time is filled with historical layers, centuries, dynasties, epochs. Even geological time can be grasped through sediment, fossils, and shifting continents. But the material of 3i Atlas predates all such structures. Its age is so great that the continents themselves are newcomers by comparison. If one were to place Earth's entire biological history on a single long scroll, the formation of 3i Atlas's core ingredients would occur somewhere far beyond the top edge, at a point inaccessible to the scroll entirely. This ancient material likely formed in the swirling disk of dust that once circled its parent star. That disk, rich with unrefined elements, would have been shaped by gravitational gathering, gentle collisions, and processes so slow that even the word gradual feels hurried. Over thousands of years, clumps grew into larger structures. Ices adhered to mineral grains. Fragments fused without haste. Out of this quiet assembly emerged the first outlines of the object we now encounter as a visitor from elsewhere. What is remarkable is how little of this material has changed since that time. In the deep cold beyond star systems, matter falls into a kind of suspended existence. There are no seasons to alter it, no atmospheric patterns to erode it, no magnetic storms to carve its surface. Chemical reactions crawl almost to a halt. Even radioactive decay, that patient sculptor of atomic identity, proceeds with a languid pace in such chill. In that sense, 3i Atlas is less an object moving through time and more a vessel carrying time within it, one that has remained sealed from alteration. The dust grains embedded within it may have seen light from stars that have since disappeared. They may have originated in ancient stellar outflows, winds from long-dead giants, remnants of supernova debris, fragments shaped by cosmic events that predate anything recognizable in the modern sky. Some of the atoms within the object might have once existed in the hearts of massive stars, where pressure forged them into their present form before scattering them across the galaxy. Yet the focus here is not on chemistry or specific minerals, but on the feeling that arises when contemplating such deep antiquity. There is something humbling about imagining a collection of particles that has outlasted continents, oceans, languages, civilizations, and perhaps even entire stellar systems. The material of 3I Atlas carries a history that does not require witnesses. It has existed in isolation for so long that isolation itself became its natural state. Even its interior may retain structures unchanged since their formation. A crack formed during an early collision might still be present, untouched by erosion. A fragment that fused imperfectly billions of years ago might still rest in place, holding the faint memory of that gentle impact. Microscopic voids within the object could have trapped gases from a time when its parent star was still young and vibrant. These features, if they exist, are not mere physical details. They are echoes of eras that the galaxy has long since moved beyond. Humans often search for relics to understand their origins. Fossils, ruins, artifacts. 3I Atlas is a relic on a scale that defies such analogies. It does not tell the story of a species or a culture, but of the universe's earliest creative moments, when dust and gas began choosing shapes that would someday become worlds, moons, comets, or solitary travelers. It belongs to a time before narrative, before memory, before anything could observe it. The age embedded in its material invites contemplation, not of how long it has lasted, but of how much it has outlasted. It has survived temperatures that would shatter glass, pressures that would flatten buildings, distances that exceed imagination. It has remained intact despite drifting through cosmic regions where collisions, though rare, can be devastating. Its persistence is not heroic. It is simply the natural outcome of existing in environments where change is so infrequent that durability becomes the default state. To drift through space for millions of years without disintegrating requires no intention, only luck and the gentle conditions of interstellar emptiness. But to arrive in our solar system carrying the unaltered signatures of a bygone era that transforms the object from a traveler into a messenger, not a deliberate messenger, of course. 3I Atlas did not volunteer for this role, but its material speaks, in a quiet and ancient way, of processes that shaped the galaxy long before Earth's story began. In contemplating this material, older than memory, older than the landscapes beneath our feet, we are reminded that the universe holds a history far deeper than any we typically imagine. And for a brief moment, as 3I Atlas wanders through our corner of space, that ancient history drifts close enough for sunlight to touch it, and for us to wonder at what endurance truly looks like. There is a certain gentleness to the boundaries of astronomical knowledge, a softness that stands in contrast to the precision many imagine when they think of science. Telescopes and instruments can measure extraordinary things, motions of stars thousands of light years away, traces of molecules drifting through nebula. But even these powerful tools eventually reach a horizon beyond which certainty dissolves into possibility. In the study of a fleeting visitor like 3I Atlas, those horizons appear sooner than one might wish. encouraging astronomers to practice one of the field's most understated disciplines, the acceptance of not knowing. This acceptance is not resignation. It is more akin to recognizing the shape of a coastline through fog, not by forcing clarity, but by acknowledging the blur as part of the landscape. When scientists examine an object that spends only a short time within observational reach, they gather what they can. Brightness values, positional measurements, color data, changes over time. These numbers hold meaning, yet each is wrapped in uncertainty. Tiny fluctuations in atmosphere, faint instrumental quirks, or even the object's own unpredictable qualities weave subtle ambiguities into the data. And rather than resisting those ambiguities, astronomers learn to carry them gently, like a fragile parcel whose contents remain partly unknown. With 3i Atlas, nearly every measurement comes traced with a margin, an acknowledgement that the universe rarely speaks with perfect clarity. When plotting its brightness over time, the curves wobble slightly. Not enough to confuse, but enough to remind observers that no graph is a complete representation of reality. When calculating its trajectory, researchers note the influence of factors too small to quantify precisely, yet too persistent to ignore. Each uncertainty is cataloged, not erased, and the resulting models become a conversation between what is known and what is only likely. In this way, astronomy often proceeds less like a march and more like a quiet walk along the boundary of comprehension. The goal is not to conquer the unknown, but to explore just far enough into dimness to describe its outline. The remaining darkness, where numbers thin and signals weaken, is not a failure of method. It is simply where the universe chooses to remain private. The soft limits of knowing become particularly apparent when trying to decipher the internal properties of something like 3i Atlas. Its composition cannot be sampled. Its texture cannot be touched. Its temperature cannot be measured directly. Instead, astronomers infer these traits from the way light behaves as it interacts with the surface. But every inference carries the flavor of probability. One model may suggest a reflective crust. Another may point toward darker, more muted materials. Both explanations might fit the data reasonably well, forcing researchers to speak not in absolutes, but in weighted likelihoods. Even the rotation period, a seemingly straightforward property, can become elusive. The object's brightness flickers in patterns that imply spin, but those patterns are layered with complexities, tumbling motions, uneven geography, varied reflective patches. Sorting these signals into a single definitive rotation rate would require more data than its brief stay provides. Instead, astronomers offer ranges, each accompanied by the caveat that more information would refine the estimate, but more information will not arrive. The object continues onward, indifferent to the desire for precision. This is where astronomy reveals a unique form of humility. Many sciences grow frustrated when encountering unknowns. Astronomy often treats them with quiet reverence. The vastness of space has taught its practitioners that limits are not obstacles, but natural edges of exploration. To know everything would suggest that the universe had run out of surprises. a notion both unrealistic and, frankly, somewhat disappointing. Uncertainty keeps curiosity alive. It provides the space in which new questions can rest. Even statistical confidence, that comforting numerical measure, begins to feel softer when applied to rare phenomena. An interstellar visitor is not part of a large population that can be sampled repeatedly. There is no catalog of thousands from which to draw averages. Instead, each object stands alone, offering a single opportunity for measurement. Probability becomes a subtle companion, reassuring but never insistent. It tells scientists how strongly the evidence leans in one direction, while whispering that the story could still tilt another way. And when the measurements fade into noise, as they inevitably do, the shift is gentle, not abrupt. A reading grows faint. A signal dips below detection thresholds. The object moves too far for instruments to follow. Data points trail off until they resemble the traces of footprints disappearing into morning fog. The scientists watching do not chase the fog. They simply mark the boundary, acknowledging that the rest of the journey lies outside visibility. This attitude embodies a deeper truth about how astronomy approaches the universe. By listening as far as hearing is possible, and allowing silence to take over where it must. The silence is not emptiness. It is the remainder, the space left for conjecture, imagination, and humility. It invites astronomers to express their conclusions with care, layering their findings with respect for the unknown. 3i Atlas, in particular, offers a poignant reminder of these soft limits. It arrived briefly, shared a modest amount of information through reflection and motion, and then drifted away before anyone could insist on further explanation. It did not grant final answers because it did not owe any. Its visit illustrated that understanding is sometimes partial by design, that the universe reveals enough to spark interest, but not so much that curiosity ever reaches an end point. In embracing these partial truths, astronomers find a certain peace. Precision is valuable, but so is the art of holding uncertainty without discomfort. The beauty of studying the cosmos lies not only in what is learned, but also in what remains quietly out of reach. And so the limits of knowing remain soft, not sharp, edges that blur rather than cut. They offer, within their indistinctness, a gentle space for wonder. Because sometimes the most meaningful understanding arises not from certainty, but from gracefully acknowledging where certainty cannot go. The arrival of 3i Atlas created a ripple, a small, precise disturbance in the flow of human attention. Not a cultural uproar, not a wave of existential dread, but a soft widening of eyes among those who spend their nights watching the sky. For most people on Earth, the visitor passed unnoticed, tucked neatly behind the glow of their daily concerns. But in observatories and research centers, the presence of this drifting traveler became a momentary gravitational pull all its own, tugging minds toward screens, simulations, and newly refreshed data logs. There is something charming about how quickly humans gather around the unfamiliar. A visitor from another star system does not alter the tides or distort the planets. It does not speak, glow dramatically, or rearrange constellations. It simply arrives, faint and quiet. And yet, within days, dozens of professionals find themselves rearranging their schedules around its appearances, while amateurs stay up late capturing images that resemble distant specks but feel emotionally like treasure. In this way, 3i Atlas becomes a sort of temporary celebrity, albeit one that behaves nothing like the kind humans usually elevate. It offers no interviews, keeps no social media presence, and refuses to participate in promotional tours. Its contribution to fame is limited to showing up briefly in the sky and allowing photons to reflect off its surface. Nevertheless, it receives attention. Graphs are made in its honor, articles drafted on its behalf, and entire research meetings revolve around understanding its habits, humble though they may be. This curiosity is not sensational or frantic. It is patient, studious, almost tender. Researchers study the object with the same affectionate diligence one might give a bird that lands on a windowsill, aware it will leave soon, but grateful for the fleeting opportunity to observe something usually so close. And in that fleetingness lies much of the charm. A long-term resident of the solar system becomes familiar, eventually predictable. A transient visitor, by contrast, inspires a kind of attention sharpened by impermanence. People value what is temporary, even when the temporary thing in question is a dim speck following a mathematically indifferent path. It is easy to imagine the universe watching this sudden burst of human excitement with a gentle, cosmic amusement. After all, 3i Atlas has existed for millions of years without generating so much as a whisper of commentary. Yet here, in one small corner of the galaxy, a species with a fondness for categorizing things finds itself captivated by a newcomer who does not even acknowledge their existence. The object does not know it has been detected, does not sense the attention, and continues on its journey without adjusting its behavior. The disturbance is entirely one-sided, occurring within human thought alone. Still, the attention is not wasted. It is, in its own quiet way, a celebration of the human impulse to learn. There is no direct benefit to spending hours modeling the behavior of a visitor that will never return. There is no practical advantage in dedicating computing power to simulating its path, its possible structure, or its shifting brightness. And yet these efforts feel worthwhile simply because they represent curiosity itself, a kind of intellectual hospitality offered to a traveler who will not stay long enough to appreciate it. There is also a subtle humor in how quickly humans begin forming questions the object cannot answer. Researchers wonder about its birthplace, its composition, its rotation, its past collisions, its long-term future. 3i Atlas, meanwhile, drifts calmly along, offering none of these details and showing no concern for the discussions it inspired. The silence is not stubborn. It is simply natural. The object behaves exactly as it would whether observed or ignored. Yet humans persist, deciphering what they can, guessing when they must, content with the challenge. This brief disturbance in attention reveals something gentle about human nature, the desire to notice, even when noticing serves no tangible purpose. Curiosity does not always demand utility. It often exists simply because the mind enjoys stretching toward the unknown. In the case of 3I Atlas, the unknown is wrapped in distance, motion, and the inability to gather detailed information before the object slips away. But that too becomes part of the appeal. It is a reminder that not all pursuits require long-term payoff. Some simply invite momentary wonder. And the wonder, fleeting as it is, creates its own rhythm. Emails circulate. Telescope time is requested. Data is plotted. People stop mid-conversation to check if new observations have arrived. It is a brief choreography, an improvised dance performed by a community who understands perfectly well that the performer they are watching does not even know the stage exists. When the object begins to fade from detectability, the disturbance quiets. Not abruptly, but gradually, like the end of a gentle rainfall. Attention shifts back to other projects, other questions. The world resumes its previous pace. For those who studied 3I Atlas closely, there may be a sense of soft neutrality rather than longing. After all, the encounter always carried an implicit farewell. Nothing was promised. Nothing was expected to linger. Yet the memory remains, not as a dramatic chapter, but as a calm interlude marked by curiosity in its purest form. The object came, the attention rose, and then both continued along their natural paths. The event leaves behind no upheaval, only a quiet reminder that the human mind is extraordinarily good at caring about things that will never know it was cared for. In the cosmic scale, the disturbance was negligible. In the human scale, it was meaningful. And in the universe's patient sweep, those two truths coexist without contradiction. The departure of 3I Atlas begins almost imperceptibly, not because its speed is slow, its velocity remains quite respectable, but because there is no single moment that announces the transition. Nothing marks the threshold between here and away. Unlike the decisiveness of a spacecraft launching from a surface or a comet rounding the sun, this visitor's exit unfolds as an extension of the same quiet momentum it displayed on arrival. There is no pause, no pivot, no gesture acknowledging that the solar system is fading behind it. It simply continues, as if the entire episode were a bend in a much longer journey rather than a meaningful event unto itself. From the perspective of Earth, the fading begins when the reflected sunlight grows too faint to measure consistently. The brightness logs thin. Observations become patchier. Telescopes must search harder for the small, receding point of light, and even then, they often come up empty. The disappearance is not dramatic, more like a lantern carried into the distance until its glow merges with the surrounding darkness. Astronomers watch this diminishing with a sense of professional acceptance. They knew the encounter would be short, and the universe has kept that promise with courteous efficiency. As the object moves farther from the sun, the light that once revealed its profile begins to fall off rapidly. The same sunlight that briefly traced its rotation, its surfaces, its angles, now weakens with geometric inevitability. No amount of curiosity or instrumental precision can reverse the mathematics of distance. The object becomes dimmer with a predictability that feels almost diplomatic, a slow bow of retreat, offered not because 3i Atlas intends politeness, but because the laws of nature conduct their affairs with quiet consistency. Beyond a certain point, the object enters a region where human observation becomes symbolic rather than literal. Models replace measurements. Estimates replace certainty. The path remains known, but only in the way a trail is known long after a hiker has vanished from sight. Still mapped, yet emptier without the figure that once animated it. The object, of course, takes no notice of this shift. It continues moving outward, the solar system's influence gradually loosening around it, like a garment being slipped off without ceremony. There is something unexpectedly gentle in this departure. Many natural events announce themselves. Storms swell, tides rise, planets eclipse. Even asteroids often display a flair for spectacle when entering or leaving Earth's vicinity. But 3i Atlas observes none of these tendencies. Its exit lacks both flourish and farewell. Its trajectory bends slightly under the last tug of the sun, then straightens into a path that leads it back toward the vast, dim expanse between stars. The movement is steady, almost meditative, as though shaped by a profound comfort with direction. One might imagine the solar system itself watching the departure with a kind of parental neutrality. Safe travels, then, spoken not aloud, but through the continued calm of gravitational silence. The planets, each fixed in their rhythms, pay no special attention. They do not adjust their orbits or shift their rotations. They simply persist, unaffected. Even the sun, whose gravity altered the object's path for a brief interval, provides no lingering hold. Once the curve of the hyperbolic trajectory unfurls into outbound motion, the star's influence dwindles into a faint suggestion. The object moves on, and the solar system turns back to its usual dynamics. If 3i Atlas were capable of biography, its chapter on the solar system would be disproportionately small, little more than a parenthetical note in a story defined by ages of wandering. The entrance and exit differ only in direction. Neither interrupts its overall identity. The solar system is a location it encounters, not a place it visits. The difference is subtle but meaningful. Visiting implies intention, a sense of choosing to arrive or depart. Encountering suggests coincidence, a moment of overlap between two entities following their own independent paths. For humans who often frame departure in emotional terms, the neutrality of this exit can feel almost philosophical. There is no longing, because longing requires the possibility of return. There is no gratitude, because gratitude assumes awareness. The departure of 3i Atlas is pure continuation, a demonstration that the majority of the universe moves without narrative arcs. The movement is not empty of meaning, but empty of intention, and this emptiness has a soothing quality. As it travels outward, the temperatures around it begin dropping again, returning toward the profound cold of deep space. The sunlight, once a gentle companion, weakens into a whisper and then into a silence. Shadows disappear because shadows require light, and light is quickly becoming scarce. The object transitions into the same environment that shaped its long voyage toward us, a realm where stillness outweighs activity and where even motion feels muted. In this context, the departure becomes less an ending and more a restoration. The solar system, with all its dynamic features, comets brightening, planets reflecting, dust swirling, offered a brief interlude of illumination. Now 3i Atlas returns to the environment where such illumination is optional, where surfaces hold their cold without interruption, and where nothing demands visibility. It is resuming the journey for which its very existence seems suited, a long, steady passage across distances that normalize solitude. Eventually, it will slip beyond the region influenced by the sun's gravity entirely. At that boundary, one invisible to the eye but clear in the equations, the object will once again enter a state of motion untouched by nearby stellar bodies. It will drift into a galactic environment vast enough that even assigning a direction feels ambitious. And as it does, the solar system will become just another point it passed by, brief and uneventful from the object's perspective. There will be no final glance back, no lingering brightness to mark the boundary. Only the continuation of movement, as dependable and unembellished as the laws that govern it. Leaving without ceremony is not indifference in any dramatic sense. It is simply the natural way of things that do not require beginnings or endings to guide their course. 3i Atlas departs as it arrived, quietly, consistently, and with a certainty that needs no audience. There is a particular peace that settles in when we acknowledge that the universe is under no obligation to clarify itself. It moves according to rules that can be measured but not persuaded, revealing only what it chooses and withholding the rest with a calm that feels almost intentional, though of course it is nothing of the sort. Objects like 3i Atlas drift through our awareness briefly, then continue on, offering only glimpses before dissolving back into the expanse that formed them. And as they do, they remind us, gently, almost sleepily, that explanation is not a cosmic priority. For all the attention it received, 3i Atlas never paused to provide context. It did not introduce itself, describe its origins, or declare its itinerary. It offered no apologies for arriving unannounced, and no promises about what secrets its material might contain. It entered the solar system with the barest acknowledgement of the sun's gravity, behaved according to physics that has operated for billions of years, and then departed without adjusting its pace. Everything humans learned about it came from interpreting reflections, motions, and probabilities, none of which were intended as messages. In this silence lies a form of serenity. The universe does not burden us with explanations. We supply those ourselves, stitching narratives from fragments of observation. 3i Atlas invites contemplation precisely because it leaves so much unsaid. When there is no clear answer to a question, the mind can either strain towards certainty or relax into possibility. The latter option, though less instinctive, often proves more soothing. It allows unknowing to exist without tension. Astronomy, perhaps more than any other science, is practiced in the shadow of incompleteness. Telescopes capture faint patterns that may never repeat. Signals drift in and out of detectability. Objects appear for days or weeks, then slip permanently beyond reach. And through it all, researchers learn to embrace the partial nature of cosmic understanding. They do not demand closure because the universe does not operate with arcs or resolutions. It operates with presence and absence, arrival and departure, each unfolding without commentary. Three-Eye Atlas embodies that style of storytelling, one without a beginning presented to us, and without an ending we are allowed to watch. It arrives mid-sentence and leaves before the sentence concludes. The only portion we witness is the clause that briefly intersects with our own. And even that clause is incomplete. Faint observations, limited data, brief opportunities that feel almost accidental. Yet those moments are enough to spark reflection that stretches far beyond the object itself. There is something quietly freeing about meeting a mystery that makes no demands. The object does not ask to be solved. It does not require defense or devotion. It simply exists, indifferent to comprehension, and humanity's curiosity fills the space around it like a soft illumination. The universe continues not explaining itself, and somehow this lack of explanation becomes its own kind of explanation. That understanding is not a prerequisite for wonder. When people speak of cosmic humility, they often imagine it as something dramatic, a confrontation with an impossibly vast scale or an overwhelming celestial event. But humility can arise quietly as well, in the recognition that many things are not meant to be resolved. The trajectory of Three-Eye Atlas, the age of its material, the details of its birthplace, the precise nature of its motion, each question leads to more questions, until the structure of inquiry itself becomes part of the beauty. Not knowing does not diminish the experience, it shapes it. In this soft uncertainty, the object becomes less a physical entity and more a metaphor for the way the universe drifts through our awareness, appearing unexpectedly, departing without explanation, and leaving behind a sense of spaciousness. Like a thought that arrives during a dream and fades before morning, Three-Eye Atlas touches human consciousness without insisting upon interpretation. It reminds us that mystery is not a deficit. It is a presence in its own right. There is a subtle humor, too, in imagining the universe quietly continuing its business while humans ponder the meaning of a single visitor. Stars evolve, clouds of dust gather and disperse, galaxies rotate with unhurried endurance. Against this backdrop, one small object happens to wander close enough for a species on an unremarkable planet to notice. That species then spends weeks producing analyses, discussions, and careful models, all for an encounter the universe did not arrange. The disproportion is almost charming, attention lavished on a fragment that carries no narrative beyond movement. And yet, it is precisely this disproportion that makes the experience uniquely human. Curiosity thrives on the gaps between knowledge. It finds comfort not only in answers, but in the awareness that answers need not always exist. Three-Eye Atlas becomes a reminder that wonder does not require completion. The universe may not explain itself, but it offers moments, brief, luminous, passing, that invite reflection without insisting on understanding. As the object recedes into darkness, it takes nothing from us. It leaves no empty space that must be filled, no sense of unfinished obligation. Instead, it leaves a quiet impression, like the trace of a dream that lingers just long enough to soften the day. It becomes part of the vast, gentle backdrop of things that exist beyond certainty, an archive of mysteries that enrich the night sky simply by remaining unresolved. And in that unresolved quality lies a kind of rest. Not everything must be known. Not everything must be named. The universe continues, serenely untroubled by our questions, and we continue as well, learning to appreciate the tranquility of partial answers. In the end, Three-Eye Atlas teaches nothing outright, offers no revelations, and departs without ceremony. But in doing so, it provides something rare, permission to let curiosity drift freely, unattached to outcomes. The universe does not explain itself. It does not need to. It unfolds, and we observe. And sometimes, the most restful truth we can encounter is that this, in its quiet incompleteness, is enough.